Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Terra Prime Live. Welcome to our class here this evening, or this afternoon, or whenever you're joining us today. Um, we, of course, will have all of our normal stuff up. We got the live chat going, and so go ahead and ask some questions in there, and we'll try to get to them. Otherwise, we'll just we've got our class here, which will field out questions here. So today, what I wanted to work on, what I wanted to talk about was something that was brought up also kind of in the other blogosphere YouTubers, which is defense. Now we kind of very efficiently categorize everything that we do in defense in Serasu. So Serasu is the defensive kind of technique. So everything we talk about when we're talking about defense, we usually apply to Serasu. It's not that you don't use these techniques everywhere else. As we are fond of saying, every time you walk into a competition setting or do a fight or something like that, you are bringing all of your skills, not just the ones that are, you know, categorized whichever way. So let's talk about Serasu in that particular venue. Now, Matt Easton of Scholarly Editorial put out a video today which was talking about other defensive techniques other than blocking. And that's what got me kind of thinking. So when we're talking about defense, we usually are thinking about this. One of the most common complaints that we get on YouTube depictions of Serasu is that it's not defensive enough. There's no attacks in Serasu. There's no this, that, or the other. And we're not supposed to move our blade a whole bunch because if we move it a whole bunch, then we're open and all that kind of thing. And so let's address a lot of that. Now, Serasu training, the way we do it is, yes, it is mostly focused in our minds on defense. So we're thinking about blows coming in and us dealing with them and going through the different, responses that we have to those types of things. Yes, blocking is one of those things. And if we are just blocking, like if we're waiting for somebody to come in and we are not going to attack back, we can simply defend, simply guard ourselves and all of that. And yes, for that, we probably don't want our saber to go too much off of our center. Absolutely. But there's a lot of other things that we can do. Now, with a lightsaber, which is round, there are some designations from sword which need a little bit of explanation. So let me talk about, before we go into that, the way defensive techniques are kind of categorized in my parent art of Chinese swordplay, and of course my style. So we have basically two groups of techniques which we label defensive techniques as. One is ge, which means to obstruct or whatever, and that's your blocking. Okay. Now, in a kind of conceptual sense, this really most ge techniques are going to be done this way on the blade. So we're either going to be hitting with the edge or somewhere near it. Okay, so even if we're not coming in perpendicular edge to edge like this, if we're coming here like this, right, the point is that we are directly opposing what's coming in here. Okay, and then the other way we have is called xi, which kind of translates to wash, but it's related to a Ming Dynasty concept of wash, which is washing things on a washboard, and that is usually done with the flat, so that we're deflecting, we're sliding things across the flat of our blade. Right now, that gives us some direction. Right, so if I come like this and I parry a strike here on my flat, right? My edge is positioned that I can instantly kind of and very easily come through and perform a strike with edge alignment. Now, we don't need to think about edge alignment when we're thinking about the lightsaber. Okay, so when we have our LED sabers, it's round. Every portion attacks and defends in exactly the same manner. Okay, at least ostensibly. Now, we won't get into the conceptual ideas about what happens with a dark saber and all that kind of thing. But for what we're doing, for the tools that we're doing, if you're doing ASL FFE, if you are doing TSL, if you're doing anything like this, you're going to be going up against round blades. You're going to be going up against, and you're going to be using a round blade. So that's what we're going to talk about. So really what we have, since we don't have a flat or an edge, those designations don't really mean a whole lot. So we can think about it in kind of three different ways. And we like to, put things into threes. And these are the three basic ways. And we'll talk about some other ways as well, additionally. But the three basic ways is you can receive a blow, right? So, boom, okay, right? I can block it, right? I just, boop, and I receive it, okay? You can deflect a blow, which is I can come up here and I can direct it off of my, of its target, whatever, and then you can beat a blow, right? So you can come in and basically just hit the other person's blade, right? Each of these things has its own drawbacks, its own strengths, and its own context in which it's going to be used. Obviously, a receiving a block, a passive block, some people call it a hard block, any of that kind of thing. It's very good at defense, but then again, it's also static, so it takes a little bit of energy and a little bit of time to recover from it. Anytime you're allowing the other person to attack you unperturbed, you are increasing your own chances of getting hit, right? So it's not necessarily the greatest thing to do all the time. Sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want to lure an opponent into a particular position, and this is a good way to kind of do it. Now, the other way is deflecting, so you can move it away with one of these motions where I'm, it's so difficult to do this stuff without a partner now, right? Where you are moving it off to the side, down, that kind of thing. Also, if you connect with it and you move through it, you can then move off to the side. Now, some people say that is what a parry is. I just use the term parry to mean any type of defensive technique. So there's different types of parries, right? So here's the deflective parry. Now with a beat, right, you're coming in, that can not only stop the strike, it can move the other person's, the opponent's weapon offline. It can cause them to have to recover and abandon their original technique. So beats are often useful. The difficulty with beats is if you miss, you now have extra force and extra distance to cover to defend yourself. And one of a very, very common scenario is somebody comes in for a beat, misses, now they're open here and the other person just comes in with a tap. And that happens in all rule sets. So there you go. Now, all of these issues are addressed in the type of training that we do with Suresu. So let's first of all talk about orbits, right? The first level of orbits, as we are doing things like this, right, is learning how the saber, the weapon, moves through space, right? What angles we can get it at comfortably, where we can, move and displace this particular weapon around our body. Okay. We will sometimes call that the circle of shelter, that kind of thing. But as we're here, right, my blade goes around. Now, as far as hard blocks, we'll call them that, right, or, receiving blows, orbits train our positioning. So that if I'm from this position and something is coming into my shoulder, right, it's a very easy manner for me to move my saber to that point, right? And then bring it along so that it's in one motion, so that I'm not going huh, huh, but I'm more going like that or here. Okay. Also, that sets you up for a riposte. Okay. So if you're doing a parry riposte where you're going to receive a blow and then you want to return, right, an orbit is very good in that sense. Right. Now, with deflections, if you are in a situation where you are bound with the opponent, where you are in contact with their blade, right, being able to stay into contact with that blade and move your tip and hilt around, right, whether it be this way here, you can then circumvent a lot of their defenses in the same way. Okay, so a deflection here can help you there. Okay, and then with beats, here's the thing, right? Yes, a beat is you're striking into the other weapon. Now, I'm doing this, right? And I'm stopping because there's nothing there. I know there's nothing there, right? But when you're in a live situation, there is something there. And you're waiting for that to stop you. You don't want to stop your strikes in practice in that sense, because that will not serve that technique. You need to be able to follow through, because what you need to do is you need to impart whatever energy you can from your weapon into the other person's weapon, right? That's what's going to move them. That's what's going to give you that advantage. Now, like we said, one of the most common things to happen is that you miss, right? Well, again, using orbits, you can then recover much quicker, right? Your body knows the patterns of, okay, so if my saber is being pulled down this way by inertia, I can right it by circling it this way, and then I don't have to fight and recover from the inertia that I've just put into that particular thing, right? So there's that. Okay. Now, so that's based, kind of how these types of exercises help you. You're very rarely, unless you're trying to, mess with the people. I mean, again, in ASL FFE, you can use it as an arming technique and all of that. But more than likely, as you're defending, you're not going to just sit there and do that. This is an exercise. It is a skill. It is a drill. Don't overthink it. Keep your hand on it, right? Don't open the hand here if you're doing this for martial arts sake or competition sake or anything like that. But as far as that goes, just keep these simple rules kind of there and relax and do it, because that's what's going to pattern the useful skill out of that, so that you can move your saber wherever you want. You understand how it moves with inertia, with momentum, and how you can counteract that. You don't have to directly bring it to a stop and then bring it back over. You can let it follow through, come through to through another angle. There's all kinds of things. If we add to this body motion, dodges, footwork, we get pretty much the potential for your entire catalog of defensive techniques, right? Learning your footwork. We always say, 70 to 80% of sword work is footwork, right? Don't be in the dangerous place, right? But what is often the case, a lot of times, and this is very, very common in the Chinese martial arts and other martial arts that use weapons more, in a little bit more of a allegorical sense. You see a lot of times what you'll see are voids, which means you're basically just dodging out of the way. You're not interacting with the other person's weapon at all, and you're going for, a piece. So I'm stepping to the side, and then I'm striking. That is, of course, an ideal, right? We don't want, the ideal scenario for us is so that we throw our technique, it goes through the person's defenses, and that's about it. And we don't have to worry about it. We're not in the way. However, that is often not the case, or not even possible. We will have, oh, all right. So, but we have the we cannot move our body, our entire self, as fast as we can move our sword, right? As fast as we can move our hands, as fast as we can move our weapon, right? So there is the inherent, difficulty of the void. Voiding is absolutely something that you want to be able to do. It's something that you want to be able to practice, all that, but we don't want to put all of our eggs in that one basket, because oftentimes we're not within a range when we're going back and forth to void. We are, we are still within their circumference of attack. So, it's very difficult to void at that point. We have to then move out of it or something like that. If you combine voiding, dodging, blocking, beats, deflections, right, all of that kind of thing, now you're starting to get into a really good mix of techniques that you can use in a defensive way, right? After that, you use those basic principles of just being able to place your weapon between you and the opponent, right? Or the opponent's weapon. Then learning how to kind of manipulate the opponent's weapon. Then learning how to manipulate the opponent's position, and using all of those things together. Now, oftentimes a beat is one of the first things that people will learn and people will do. And that is very natural, because it is a very intuitive thing to just beat back an attack, right? The problem comes in is that when you're not used to doing this and you don't have your timing right, you will often miss and come through. Hence, our use of orbits, our use of all of these exercises. When you see the very complicated serrated form, right? You have lots of these, right? Ideas, right? All that. It's all about, being able to understand the movement that you're going through, that your weapon is going through, being able to place that in the opponent, and understanding what will happen if you do specific things at specific times, right? That's really, really the whole goal here. Okay, so that's kind of a basics here. Let me open up the floor to any questions anybody's got. How is everybody doing out there?
Pretty fantastic. I do have a question. I know, you were talking about how your body motion and everything comes into play as far as including the blade movements. But what about the advanced stancing that system brings up for like twist stance and stuff like that? How does that get incorporated into a defensive mindset?
Say that again. The last part about that again.
So with the advanced stances like twist stance and empty stance and things of that nature, how do those come into play? Can we get a demonstration of how those come into play in a defensive mindset?
Okay. Okay, so if what we're talking about are the, kind of particular stances that are usually introduced at the Ceresu slash Ataru level in our system here. Um, we have, of course, our dewback rider, our front stance, our kneeling stance, that kind of thing. We then add our drop stances, which are down like that, our cross steps, and our cross stances, kneeling stances, and then, of course, empty steps, which are where the front foot appears to be on the ground and holding you, but it is not, right? Um, so there's those. Now, those stances, as far as what you're going to be using with your footwork, right, um, are about changing levels and about changing weight, right? So your empty stance, we'll start with that one there because that's probably the easiest to kind of understand. Since this leg is empty, it is free, right? Now, most of the time, when we are in some sort of combative event, right, we'll favor our forward foot, right? Why? Because if we're trying to press forward, as we should in those particular situations, we are going to want to keep our back foot free so that we can move and press forward when we get that opportunity. It's just kind of an intuitive thing that you kind of get used to, and that's the point. People are used to seeing us kind of favoring that foot. And so we don't really even think about this. We just assume that whichever foot is forward is not going to be the one that is going to step or is going to move or is going to involve any type of thing, just in a kind of remember, during a fight or during some sort of altercation, so much is happening. Your brain has to compartmentalize and really focus on what is what it deems very, very important at the time, right? So that's where a false step comes in. Okay, if I'm here, I give a kind of wrong impression of where my weight is, and thus, it gives mixed signals on how I can move out of that position, right? So that would be one of the uses for the false step. Also, false step, I can use a hut slide to close distance very, very easily without even having to change, right? Because my front foot being empty can easily just step forward and do that. And that's a very, very quick thing. And if we're close enough for that to be a useful thing, oftentimes people aren't even looking down, right? They're focused up here because this is where our weapons are, right? So that's kind of how and that also kind of illustrates the mindset of kind of approaching techniques in a defensive way. These are the issues that we're talking about. Okay, so the cross steps and all of that, or the going down here, there's a lot of uses for that as far as the twisting motions, coming into there. One of the most probably especially in the form, is that it's a control stance, meaning if I'm really throwing my body weight into something, right, this stance is a good way that I can take all of that energy, whether it's going forward to the side, down or anything like that, and turn it around and bring it back to my center so that I can stop, right? You see that a lot in things where you kick and then you come down into that cross step, and you've also got that second step that's nice and chambered there for you. This is where we get more into launching counterattacks, which a lot of people complain about when they talk about Ceresu, but there's that. Okay, we have another question here real quick, James. What about disarms? So, yes, so James, for you, just where do they fit, or?
Do you consider disarms a defensive technique, or is it more of an opportunity that comes up?
Well, that's a good question, because are disarms necessarily defensive? In order to disarm somebody, it's not always that easy, right? You either have to, put enough force into it or get them at a particular time, kind of tricky. Your defensive techniques, however, will allow you to create those opportunities for disarms, right? Whether or not you consider the actual disarm a defensive technique or not is kind of immaterial, because the real trick to a disarm is getting into the position where you can disarm them, whether it's getting them into, and again, this is one of those things, if you get into the habit of opening up your hand, what will happen is if you go back into these positions, your fingers may reflexively just open up. If you start to see that in an opponent, that's something that you can look for and that you can capitalize on, right? I can then here's a good example of defensive techniques that are used in an offensive way. Whereas if I'm bound with the person, I can deflect them off to the side so that they bring their saber down to here, knowing that this hand is going to open up, at which point I can reach up and pretty much just grab it right out of their hand. Now, it sounds like, a really odd thing to happen. It doesn't happen that often, but I will say that it does happen enough that I do it at times when I'm playing around with people. So it's, and I usually only do it to illustrate a point of, keep your hand closed. But that's the thing. So the disarm itself, is it there? Is it not? Obviously, it uses the empty hand. So that seems to go for a defensive kind of idea. You do have to have a defensive mindset, but I would say a disarm is a level of technique which gets into where we get into Form 5, where it's basically a hybrid of the techniques that are coming before, because it needs defensive, it needs aggressive, it needs your footwork, it needs all of those things to work. So it's kind of, I would say, an advanced rather than necessarily a defensive or offensive technique. So hopefully that answers a bit. Nothing else left on the chat there. Okay. All right, Roberto, you were asking the bind. So the bind, as we talk about it here, is that just where does the bind fit, or just what to do with the bind, or?
Yeah, I was wondering on a similar vein as James' question with the disarms on their position between defensive, offensive, or somewhere in between seizing an opportunity. Binds, when you were talking about the difference between our round lightsabers and a bladed weapon, it seems when you use the edge of a bladed weapon, you catch edge against edge. It's a little bit easier to bind. When you wash against the flat of the weapon, it's a little bit easier to deflect. But with round lightsabers, it's a little bit more ambiguous whether or not you are going for a bind or you're going to just seizing the opportunity. So would a bind be an opportunity seized, or would it be something that just happens to take place when you're doing a defensive technique? Would it be something that more of a happenstance, that two techniques find themselves opposed in a way that binds them, or would it be something that you're trying to maneuver into like you would with a disarm?
So yeah, that too. So binding is, I wouldn't necessarily call it, it's not necessarily a technique in and of itself. It is a condition that you find yourself in, right? But you can use binds to certain effects. To use a bind defensively means you're basically putting putting your weapon on their weapon and preventing them from taking it away without letting you in. Okay, so you put some pressure on the weapon so that they this. Now, you can't keep that up indefinitely with somebody who knows what they're doing, because as soon as you get into the bind, you don't have to be passive in the bind. Okay, a bind is more like a range that we get into. Okay, the techniques that we use defensively, that we train in Soresu, will come up. If we're in a bind, we can use the orbits, use all of that kind of thing to maneuver ourselves around, not necessarily to get an upper hand on the other person, but to deal with what they're doing. Now, this is what I mean by binding is not necessarily technique. If I know how to use binds and my opponent does not, maybe they just picked it up today, and I bind with them, they're still binding. They just can't do anything in that situation because they don't know what to do. And that's kind of the purpose of a bind. If you're going to do a bind defensively, right, you've usually got an aggressive opponent, right, coming in, throwing lots of strikes. Maybe they're very fast, right? So you don't want to trade blows with them because they're faster than you, right? Well, you connect with their sword and you come into a range where they cannot get off those techniques at that time. That's using a bind defensively. But once you're in that range, you cannot just let that bind sit. You must do something with it. The trope of the people binding and then carrying on dialogue, it's not, I mean, it's not exactly realistic, but it's not necessarily outside of the realm of possibility. People are tired, right? You both get into a bind and get up to each other and you're just, trying to, catch your breath or something like that. But generally speaking, once you get into a bind, you have to utilize it to your advantage because it's a dangerous position to be in, right? That's where we're talking about the range. We're still within their attack circumference, so we can't really void unless we duck a lucky one or something like that. So the point is to keep our blade on theirs, keep them busy so they can't launch the attacks that they want to do. Now, that being said, if we get into a bind here, I can very, very easily use it very aggressively, right? I can try to power through their particular defenses by pushing their weapon up into them, right? I can move it off to the side so that I can move it off of the line so that I have a clear shot. There's all kinds of things that I can do within the bind, which are aggressive and more offensive, right? Being in a bind or being in the bind, not being in a bind, but depending on how good you are at it, being in a bind is the same thing. But again, it offers you certain things. You have to know how that goes. Being good in the bind doesn't just take defensive techniques. It takes a lot of knowledge. Again, it takes knowledge of your own things. Everything from Shicho all the way up is needed there because you need to have good structure, right? Like this has to be at a point where they're not going to touch you, right? And that you have enough room to weather a little bit of this here too. It slows down the action so I can bring this in and I can use those body motions a little bit better, right? But again, we're connected. So more than likely, they're going to be turning with us and it becomes more of a chess match of moments than it does become, that. Oftentimes somebody will do a bind and completely overpower the other person, but that is a particular situation. So how does that answer that there?
No, that was excellent.
Yeah, so Yeah. So, and they connect, they connect with all the other, forms as well. But yeah. So these defensive techniques, right? We want to make sure that we've got these defensive techniques in there. The training that we do has to be applied generally, right? You can't get too married to say this is this and this is that, because even in a beat, that looks just like a cut, right? It's a counter cut. It's gonna have the exact same mechanics as you do here, and that's when we talk about defensive techniques just being a matter of intent, right? Oftentimes the movement, everything about it is exactly the same, but the intent is different. So, or the target. All right. Do we have anything else over there?
Alex had one or two hands in Cerezo or a combination of both.
Oh, yes. So do we use both hands on the Saber in Cerezo? You can use both. And when I say both, you can use both hands on the Saber, or you can use one hand on the Saber, right? Oftentimes people will generally use one hand. The Saber form has both, the Dulon. So you will have moments of being one-handed and moments of being two-handed. The idea is that we want to be able to kind of do both. If I'm doing if I'm doing these orbits here, right, I can still do them with both hands on the Saber, right? And I should, right? Now, when I do this one right there, obviously I have to let go because my arm does not stretch all the way across my belly, right? And that's not just because I enjoy eating too much, but it's also because you have your rib cage in the way, right? You have this kind of thing here. This is one of those limitations about breastplates that we were talking about, is that the more encased the breastplate is, the less across the body motion that you're going to get, right? Obviously, right, a two-handed guard position is going to be very, very solid, right? Being in a bind, I would very, very much, encourage people to be two-handed. When you're out and you're doing beats and that kind of thing from range, it may be better to use one hand, right? But the deal is that you want to be able, whether you're a two-handed or one-handed type of saberist, in general, you want to be able to defend yourself, well in either way, and the training should be valuable to both cases, right? If you're primarily a two-handed fighter and you're doing the one-handed stuff here, right? All of that will give you a better idea of how your weapon kind of works in that sense. And then when you have your other hand on the weapon, you can more accurately and in better, more successful ways, use your other hand to assist, right? And to, put in there. And that's why we get into that, where we say this hand is our power hand when we're using two hands, right? You don't want to do too much here, right? When we're doing with one hand and our power hand, we're looking for momentum, right? So, like there, you see? If I slash through here, I can use those orbits to come right back off of it, right? Let's say I'm going for a beat. They pull their saber away this way to come back in. I can bring the saber right back up into the line without having to stop it, restart it, and bring it to another position. So, so there we go with that. And obviously, you know, binding and all that kind of thing is going to be a little bit easier with two hands, although one-handed stuff does come into play there, you know, as well. All right. What do we got on here? We've got some, looks like some sort of Nordic being spoken on the chat right now, so I can't involve myself in that. I'm afraid I don't understand it. But anyway, so how are we doing out there? We have experiences or anything like that with anybody who's... Ben, do you have anything to add to the whole Saresu discussion?
Well, in terms of one hand versus two hand, I generally think of Saresu as a two-handed form. And, that really came home to me this summer when I started to work Saresu with metal swords as opposed to lightsabers, where you had definite hilt lengths that are less forgiving than a lightsaber's relatively uniform, medium-sized hilt that you can get two hands on. Let me tell you, when you do Saresu with a sword with a 6-inch handle, it does not work. So you can take one hand off the blade and put one hand on the blade, but I think the nature of Saresu itself and the way it builds momentum, it's built around a weapon that has that longer hilt and all the balance dynamics that go with it, right? And it supports a certain type of body movement, right? That's very different from what you might see in Makashi, right? So, in Saresu, there is a lot of time when you are only going to have one hand on the blade, but it's a choice. Like the foundation of the body movement, the foundation of the techniques that you see presuppose that it could be two the entire time. And so, just in weapon selection, I'm going to come down and say that's a two-handed form.
Okay.
I also love blade beating. I mean, I do that all the time, by the way, when I train students, but also when I fight, because that's just a very, very effective technique, especially if you understand some basic things about geometry and keeping your blade in between you and the opponent and separating their blade off from the body, right? As long as you keep that goal in mind, I want my sword here and I want his sword there. Oh my God, is this effective?
Yeah. And, that's the other thing too, is like a lot of the binding techniques are, you get them right in Shicho, right? Coming up here and, all of that kind of thing. A lot of people talk about how they'll see people holding high guards, right? Like this, and they'll say, oh, hey, no, you can't do that. You're totally open, and then you just say, okay, well, come in and try it. And so much happens up here around your head. It's just amazing. Okay, so we've got another one here from Eric about jumping, dodging, and jumping.
It's the one defensive thing that we haven't really touched upon, and it just occurred to me in ASL FFE matches, I've seen people dodge and jump, which is not something you ever really see in lightsaber combat. So I'm wondering if there really even is anything to talk about, really, but or at least how it pertains to at least ASL FFE combat.
Well, dodging and jumping would be categorized as voids. So when you're jumping or you're dodging, what you're trying to do is you're just trying to move yourself out of the way. Now, the reason is you can probably see it in ASL FFE more than other systems of rule sets and stuff like that is because we have the arming techniques and the priorities so that we have a good turn-taking type of thing. It gives the other person a little bit more time to react. They can react in a bit, more large way. The time, the time is a little bit stretched out and all that kind of thing for the rules, to make it visible and stuff like that. And it encourages stuff like that. So that's probably why you see it more in that type of thing, is that thing. Also, binding is not, going into the bind and working from the bind is not legal in ASL FFE. You have to stay out, and do that. Although you can bind from outside, right? So you can do that kind of thing or whatever, but you can't come in and start getting into the throwing and the wrestling and all that kind of thing. So that's probably why you're going to see it. In a more, hit for hit type of way, TSL, or just kind of like intuitive sparring and stuff like that, or real situations, what have you. A jump has the disadvantage of you are, for a time, completely out of control of your body. So while you are in the air, you have no ability to change direction, to change momentum or anything like that. You are at the whim of gravity, right? So that if your jump is not well timed, is not well defended or something like that, it can actually make you more open. It's just like turning, right? If I turn my back to the opponent and come in, what makes that more dangerous than not is how close I am to the opponent when I start that turn. If I'm, 15 feet away from him and I use that little spin as a way to kind of traverse a little bit of time, but it doesn't actually bring me within attacking range of him, then there's no problem. But if I'm within attacking range, or he sees that, or he's close enough to get to me while my back is turned, then yeah, that's a problem. But again, we have to be able to see these situations and understand the dynamics that are based on us. And that's what our training is supposed to do, right? Independent of any rule set, kind of in that way. But jumping and dodging obviously is one of these techniques that's encouraged in ASL FFE because it's very it's very crowd pleasing. It's something. If I jump over somebody's saber, it's a lot more obvious to people what I did than just moving back or something like that. You see jumping a lot in choreography because of that. Sometimes you see it in a little too much, but there's that. Okay, let me see what that. You go ahead. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, let's see if we got anything else on the chat here. So we're talking about on here. There's talking about Saresu, double hand, single hand, anything like that. And there's where you get the big difference here. Whereas, so some of the forms, some of the Dulan is based on a form which is done with a sword that has a two-handed length handle. Okay, so it's not done with a gen that's a one-handed gen. So it's the difference between, and actually this is fairly good. It's the difference between these two handles here. Okay. Now, even though this one is technically considered a one-handed gen, right? It's intended to be a one-handed gen. Its handle is actually a comfortable two-handed length handle, right? I can not only hold my preferred grip here, holding on to the pommel with like this, right? And still have some play here, right? But I can choke up, I can come up here, right? We've got the bind to all of that kind of thing. Doing Saresu here with this handle, which is not, when I put my hand on here like this, my hands are not together. I don't have as much, space, anything like that. That's kind of a different thing. Now, we're all going to have different experiences of what goes on. And the lightsaber's strength is that it is all weapons, all kind of at once, right? So whether you can use it one-handed, you can use it two-handed, anything like that. I won't go as far as saying this doesn't work one-handed. If depending on what, kind of what specific, techniques and defensive strategies that you have, it's going to be easier one way or the other. Certain things are going to be there. But also, a lot of the stuff that we talk about here, especially with orbits, is not even from this weapon, but it's from Dao, which are sabers, which have a much more tip-heavy profile. I do not have one down here, I do not think. I have this southern one, which is not exactly there, but it gives an idea. This is, of course, just a wushu blade. So anyway, if we're using a Dao, right, the point of balance is usually far more out here into the blade, right, making it much more tip heavy. So one of the very common ways of recovering from saber slashes and all of that is using these orbits, right? And this is true even in Western systems of saber, military saber and stuff like that, the Molinets and the wrist, the wrist motions and stuff like that. Because when you have something that's much more forward weighted, when you bring it through, the effort that it takes to just reverse it becomes significantly greater. So, it kind of depends on that. Somebody here in the thing said that Form 5 would then be using more of one-handed. Maybe not. Again, none of this stuff is really dictated that way. Your one-handed technique is related to your two-handed technique. You can use both of them. I encourage people to use both of them, in that way, right here like this, as you're moving around. Now, of course, what you said, Robert, about swords binding and all of that, that I think personally, I've tried stuff with sharp blades and all that kind of thing. Personally, I think that idea of the Velcro blades is a little overblown, except for like completely perpendicular strikes that come in here and both blades are damaged and they kind of like fit together like that. But if you're coming in at any kind of oblique angle, if you've got a fine edge and you're not hitting that edge directly, it seems not to be that big of an issue as far as like, do things get really sticky, right? Do your swords like, and I've got them. Yeah, there's a little bit of a bite, right? But nothing to the effect of creating a completely different feeling. It would just be kind of momentary stuff like that, in my opinion. I don't know. I've never been in a fight with sharp swords. The people that I have seen fight with sharp swords, that group in Germany, they don't do a whole lot of binding. And they just they don't seem to have anything slowing them down that way. All right. Okay. So we're here sort of at the end here. So yes. So do we have anything else here before we end the broadcast? Oh, all right. We are good. All right. So here from everybody here at TPLA, thanks for joining us here today. We'll be back again next week for another class. Hope to see you all there. Please leave a comment if you have any questions. Hopefully we got to everything here today. If not, we'll try to get back to tomorrow or next week. And so there. So thanks to everybody here for joining us on the program, and to you at home. So patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.